Welcome, everyone, to our second RxTalks webinar, brought to you by Omeda Rx. We're happy to see some returning people and some new people in the audience today. Today we have our resident speakers, our own Dr. Shirley Wrights and Rich Adams. My name is Dana Madison, and I'll be one of your moderators, joined by Allison Donahue. We'll be keeping things running behind the scenes. Today I'll go over some housekeeping items, introduce our speakers, then pass it over to them to review our topic, and we'll wrap it up with questions and answers toward the end. Out of respect for our presenters, everyone is automatically muted. We will capture questions throughout the presentation using the dialog box. Simply submit your questions, and we will send them to the presenters to read and answer later in the presentation. Today's session will be recorded. As mentioned, our speakers today are Dr. Shirley Wrights and Rich Adams. Dr. Wrights currently serves as a clinical pharmacist client manager for Omeda Rx, where she has strategic responsibility for developing, communicating, and reporting the outcomes of clinical initiatives impacting both cost and quality of care to members and clients. Before joining Omeda Rx, Dr. Wrights was Director of Pharmacy Clinical Services at a large health cooperative where she was responsible for designing and implementing medication use management initiatives. Rich Adams currently serves as the Director of Product and Business Development at Omeda Rx, where he oversees sales, account management, and product development. Before coming to Omeda Rx, Rich held various sales leadership positions at industry-leading healthcare companies. Rich's career work focuses on helping organizations navigate the new health economy. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Rich Adams. Rich, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dana, and thank you, Allison. Dr. Wrights, it's great to see you again.
Good to be here. Good to be here.
Picking up right where we left off from last time, we had talked about the dramatic increase in pharmacy spend that we began experiencing in 2014 with the approval of 3 medicines, Acarapac, Harvoni, and Sovaldi, all targeted at hepatitis C. And at that point, we saw a dramatic and significant increase in pharmacy spend, almost 20% for that year, and it grabbed everyone's attention. And now as we look out at the cost of pharmacy spend in the U.S. through 2022, we see that there's an annual growth rate, compound annual growth rate of 6.9%. And that is so different than what we were seeing between 2006 all the way through 2012, where it was averaging somewhere around 2.5% to 3%. And we talked about what was driving, or what is driving that increase in cost. And we talked about brand drug price increases. We talked about the specialty pipeline. We talked about drugs that are on the medical benefit that are in the specialty pipeline, those infused medicines. We talked about the Food and Drug Administration increasing their approval rates. And then finally, we talked about pharmaceutical company advertising and its impact. Likewise, we also talked about solutions that Omeda Rx has in place. Site of care management, the ability to help patients access care and access their medicine in a higher quality, lower cost environments. Personalized therapeutic journeys, that is related to specialty care in itself. Innovative engagement programs such as our 6-tier formulary or MedSavvy. Finally, or in addition, we talked about integrated drug benefit management. And today, we'll talk about in detail with Dr. Wrights about evidence-based medicine, early, accurate, and personal. In layman's terms, evidence-based medicine is figuring out which medicine is the right medicine. The stakes are absolutely high. If we get it wrong and we don't identify the right medicine, we run the risk of massive overutilization, poor adherence and compliance, overprescribing, and dramatic increases in cost. So evidence-based medicine is absolutely critical. It's actually very hard to pull off. And there's some things that are making it more complicated today than haven't really existed in the past. So before we talk to Dr. Wrights, we want to talk about what are some of the market forces that are making evidence-based medicine or figuring out the right medicine more difficult than it was in the past. So market force number 1 of 3, volume. There is a tremendous amount of market activity from the pharmaceutical manufacturers in terms of developing and getting new medicines in front of the FDA for approval. It's larger than it's been in a very long time. Let me give you an example. You take a look at the chart here. We see that medicines that are in phase 2, phase 3, and pre-registration, that's not phase 1, the idea generation, or phase 4, that's post-release, These are medicines that are just on the cusp of being approved. It's almost 1,200. 1,200 medicines, a very, very big number. If we look down at specific disease categories for oncology, an already crowded space, we see there are 591 medicines that are under development. If we look at the neurological class, we see that there are 350 medicines that are under development. So the market force, number one, that's having a big impact and creating more challenges for evidence-based medicine is sheer volume of product that's in the pipeline. The second market force is speed. We talked about this last time, and this is the idea of the Food and Drug Administration making changes to how they approve medicines. If we look back at 2008, we saw that there were somewhere south of 50 approvals, actually 40 approvals that were released in the market in that year. If we fast forward to 2015, we see that that number is approaching 80, and it's forecasted to increase even more as we move towards 2020. That is causing challenges for evidence-based medicine just from the sheer number of products that have been approved and will continue to be approved that pharmacists and clinicians need to evaluate to determine whether they're good or bad medicines. The third driver that we're looking at is intensity. Intensity is an interesting one because as a product gets released to the market, the pharmaceutical manufacturer looks to achieve as quickly as possible something called a peak profile. That is a medicine's most profitable state. And so as we look here, we can see that in the 1970s, to become profitable and developing a drug, a medicine had to achieve about $179 million in revenue because it cost about $179 million to develop. But as we move into 2010, we see that to bring one drug to market, it costs on average $2.6 billion. That is a significant amount of investment that these organizations are making, and they need to move quick and fast so that they can overcome that operating expense and return a profit as quickly as possible. So those are three powerful market forces that are making our jobs more difficult and Dr. Wright's job more difficult as she guides and leads the evidence-based medicine process. So with that, we'll turn to Dr. Wright and start with, what is evidence-based medicine? What are its goals? What is it looking to achieve?
Thanks, Rich. Well, I want to start first in this graph that you see up on your computer right now, and looking at the right-hand side, I really want to talk about the medication and new medications that are coming out. And you can see from this, and this is a graphic that we showed last time as well, about 70 to 80% of new medications that are coming on the market are really deemed just equivalent to medications that are already on the market. But there's another 10% that are considered clinically significant, and probably another 10 to 15% that really might be considered clinically inferior products. Either they don't work as well, or they have a higher rate of side effects that we need to be concerned about. So the goal, that's really the goal of evidence-based medicine, is to discern which one, where does that medication fit in this sort of breakdown? Is it one that's equivalent to medications that we already have available? Is it a drug that's clinically superior and then can offer additional value to our patients? Or is it an inferior product? And we want to be careful how we use that medication in the future. So how does Omeda Rx do that? How do we determine where a medication fits in that breakdown graphic that you see there? If we look over on the left-hand side, you see there's this sort of funnel effect. And what we have we have about 13 really experienced clinical pharmacists who have developed into really medical sleuths. They go after evidence that's in the literature, also evidence that's not available in the literature. They talk to researchers out in the field, they talk to prescribing physicians, and they learn everything that they can about medication. It's a very rigorous process that they undertake to locate and assess all of that literature and those studies. Once they've gathered all that information, they assess it for various quality indicators. So they look at a number of different variables. So for example, they might look to see the patient population that was enrolled in the study. Is it the right patient population? Is it transferable to the patient population that will be used, that this drug will be used in the future? Who's the source of funding for the study? Did it come from a company who might have it might drive a positive outcome of the study, would help their financial setting or status. So that can impact a study. What are the processes that they followed during the study? Does it really offer any advantage for that patient population? Did they do the study long enough? For example, was it a short-term study for a drug that's a chronic disease medication? Did they do the study long enough to really ascertain, did it gain efficacy, or did it cause some side effects that we may not be aware of? At the end of the day, after all this really rigorous review of medications, our group comes up with recommendations that then go to our Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee for review and decision making. And we integrate all the best available research information and clinical experience to really determine safety, efficacy, and value for that medication.
Dr. Reitz, I know that Omeda Rx is nationally recognized for its evidence-based medicine process through an organization called ICER, and we're extremely proud of that. And it's well-earned merits. There are arguably, we can kind of haggle about the number, somewhere between 40 and maybe 55 PBMs in the country. Are all PBMs the same in terms of how they evaluate medicines and their evidence-based medicine process, or are there unique differences that we need to highlight?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think evidence-based medicine has become sort of a buzzword, and we need to think about it that it may not have as clear a definition across the country for different PBMs as it does for how we interpret it and how we use this terminology. If you look at this graphic here, you can see, for example, even the Food and Drug Administration, they have a very different way or outcomes that they look at when they approve a drug for marketing in the United States. So, for example, they really look at patient safety and clinical effectiveness. They don't take into account anything around rebates or what the value to the patient is going to be. That's not part of what their role is in evaluating drugs for marketing in the U.S. Other pharmacy benefit managers may take into account, as part of their evidence-based process, things like patient safety, but sometimes clinical effectiveness gets overrun or overturned by the importance of rebates. So if there is a good rebate on a medication, they may in fact say, well, we'll put this medication on our formulary, or we'll prefer it because the cost impact of that rebate may drive what they consider an improved outcome for that patient. However, here at Omeda Rx, what we've done is we've really looked at patient safety and clinical effectiveness. Those are the two key ingredients in determining whether a drug will, where it's going to land on our formulary. After that, entirely separate from that, we look at what cost opportunities there are. So are there rebates available for that drug? A good example of that might be a recent one with Vicarapac. So this is a drug for the treatment of hepatitis C. It came out at a reduced cost with a rebate compared to some of the medications that were already available. However, when we looked at that medication, we were really concerned about some of the side effects, some of the safety parameters with that drug, particularly because it often has to be co-administered with a drug called ribavirin, which has its own list of side effects that the patients can experience. So you couple that with complicated screening and dosing requirements, and that can impact adherence. And so ultimately, even though the drug was less expensive, you end up with poorer outcomes because the patients aren't going to be adherent with this very complex medication. And ultimately, what you're doing is increasing costs down the road.
In my mind's eye, I'm picturing the Middle Ages, and there's the white knight on one side, which is clinical effectiveness, and then a black knight on the other side, which represents rebate, and they're jousting, right? Who's going to win? Is clinical effectiveness going to win, or is rebate going to win? And are they opposed to each other like that? And is that the primary difference between PBMs and evidence-based medicine, or is it something different?
Well, it's a good question. I haven't ever really thought of it that way before, but they can be opposed. Sometimes they are. Sometimes you've got really good evidence for a drug and that you want to use, and you don't have a rebate. So they're going to be opposed to one another. Sometimes you've got evidence that doesn't support the use of a drug, but you've got a really good rebate. And so you're sort of at a struggle. Do I go with the clinical evidence that demonstrates this is a good drug and should be used, or do I go with the rebate? So that's where you have this potential jousting against one another. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we've got good drugs that are lined up with good rebates, and that's the best world that we want to be in. That's where we want to try to drive our practices.
Understood. Understood. So we've got an interesting situation here. So we have dramatically increasing pharmacy costs forecasted through 2022. We have complicating factors, market forces, velocity, speed, intensity, and then we have evidence-based medicine that's looking to make sure that we're not over-prescribing, that the right medicine is getting to the right people at the right time. And it seems to be working. Let's talk about how does it actually work on a day-to-day basis. So as we look at evidence-based medicine from a timing standpoint, how important is it for evidence-based medicine to be early? And if it is important, how does that help facilitate decision-making for prescribers or employers or even patients as well?
Well, Rich, it's really critical for it to be early. As you talked about earlier in this presentation, there's a huge amount of pressure from pharmaceutical companies. Once they get their drug approved, they're out there marketing that drug the next day, right? They're ready to go. They've got their sales team going. They're taking out information to our prescribers and to our patients through the television ads that they have or multimedia ads to encourage patients to try this medication. So there's a huge amount of pressure for us to be able to provide timely information that is really accurate around the appropriate use of this medication. So early is a key piece of providing information to our prescribers. So one of the ways that we need to do that and keep on top of that is we need to keep track of what drugs are coming out for approval by the FDA. The FDA is basically a large committee that reviews medications and makes decisions about their marketing, whether they're safe and effective. But the FDA also is made up of a number of different subcommittees that provide input into the major committee that makes the decisions. And so by tracking what the subcommittees are doing, the decisions that they're making, how they're reviewing drugs, it actually gives us sort of a leg up. We can see where medications are coming in through the process, what some of the experts in the nation are thinking about these medications, how they're reviewing the literature. It also gives us then time, prior to that drug actually being launched and marketed, gives us time to pull together all that information that I spoke about earlier, to look at all that data, to assess the appropriateness of that medication, and to put in motion our own internal processes for how we review that medication. And so within a couple of weeks of that drug being marketed, particularly if it's a high-cost specialty drug, we've got information that's ready to go out to prescribers and help them understand how this drug should appropriately be used. I think the other thing is, not only helping prescribers understand how to use the medication, but it's really helping our employer groups. So how can we help our employer groups with this early information think about how are they strategizing for what costs that they're going to see coming in the next year, particularly as it relates to some of these big budget busters. We think of Hep C and we think of oncology and some of the MS drugs, these really high-cost drugs that can really have a really high impact on employer groups' budgets. So we want to be able to provide that information to them well in advance so they can understand it as they're rolling into their coming year. We also want to help them understand how they potentially set up their benefit design. So, for example, with a lot of the specialty drugs and now the biosimilars starting to roll out through the FDA, is their benefit structure set up to take advantage of and to help steer patients to using the right drugs the first time? So we can, by getting to that early, we can sort of help our employer groups understand that.
Early evaluations, I believe, also help identify which of the medicines are most effective and can help drive adherence and compliance early on. So if a person gets the right medicine at the beginning, they're more likely to stay on that right medicine, and it'll have a positive impact for them in terms of their health status, but also for an employer. Reductions in short-term disability, reductions in absenteeism, all outcomes that we're focused on as we work with our clients to help manage their costs overall.
Yep, absolutely.
So if early evaluations are important, let's talk a little bit about accuracy. A couple of different reports that were recently released. The Institute of Medicine several years ago came out and indicated that 30 cents of every dollar is wasted within the healthcare industry. The New York Times recently came up with an article, $3 billion is wasted in oncology drugs. A large PBM, one of our competitors, actually came out with a report that said $20 billion is wasted due to overprescribing or non-adherence. How does evidence-based medicine help tackle this problem of waste, and how is it applied within the context of dramatically increasing pharmacy costs?
So in this next graphic that you see, this is actually taken from the Dartmouth Atlas, which is a wonderful website. If you've never been on it, it's a lot of fun to explore. There's all kinds of information in this. What this graphic demonstrates with these different colors across the map of the United States is the variation that's out there regarding prescribing practices. So the darker the color, the more variation there is in prescribing practices. The lighter the color, the less variation. So, there's a number of reasons that can drive variation in prescribing practices, but one of them is really inconsistent use of evidence-based medicine across the U.S. It's the the lack of use of really strategic, hard-driving evaluation of studies that help us understand what drugs are appropriate and what drugs aren't. I think you could almost apply this to any disease state. You think of, for example, diabetes type 2, a huge number of population in the United States that have type 2 diabetes. Most patients will be started on a fairly inexpensive medication, metformin, as the first-line agent. But if they fail that, or if they have some side effects from that, the second-line agent or the third-line agent that they go to, or the drugs that are added on to their therapy, are not always consistently applied across the United States. And this is where you see this huge variation. What that drives towards is that inconsistency is waste, because patients are not necessarily on the right drug at the right time. They are using drugs that are causing adverse events, so that they're stopping the drugs early, and you've already dispensed them to them, so there's a cost associated with that. And ultimately, if they're not on the right drug, it's going to drive increased costs further down the road. Again, poor outcomes, increased costs.
So if early evidence-based medicine can help with adherence and reduce cost, and accurate evidence-based medicine can help reduce waste, what can specific and personalized evidence-based medicine do? One of the most dramatic discoveries that we've experienced, and certainly I think in our lifetime in the last 10 to 15 years, has been the Human Genome Project mapping of our own DNA. And recently read an article about cancer therapies for children out of MD Anderson were not achieving the necessary outcome. And they were able to map the genome for these kids and actually tailor the medicine so that they could have a longer life. And that's certainly a fantastic outcome, and that's something that we're looking for. I step back and I think about it from another perspective. I can imagine the amount of money that was dedicated to try to save these kids and to help them live a little bit longer, spent unnecessarily, because that medicine was not necessarily as accurate or as personal as it could have been. Does evidence-based medicine have a role to play in that world, in the specific and personalized side of care?
Well, Rich, we're just really on the cusp of how evidence-based medicine is going to impact all of the work that's happening around the human genome. We're just kind of starting down that pathway, and I think over the next 5 to 10 years we're going to see it just explode. I think this example here has more to do probably with a little bit about genetics and thinking about genetic diseases that are passed on from parent to child that can impact long-term outcomes for these patients. So, for example, the PCSK9s are some medications that came out in the last few years that are really geared for a very specific subset of population of patients who have a very high risk disease called familial hypercholesterolemia. So if we didn't use our evidence, if we didn't use our understanding of the studies that were done around this medication, and we went and treated every adult patient that has hypercholesterolemia with this medication, you would, if you're an employer group of 1,000, you would be spending close to $5 million just for the treatment of that specific disease. But because we know that because through our evidence review of the medications, we know that statins are the preferred medications. We know that if you can start with those, if they can get to the maximum dose, plus using a couple of other medications that are available, if we know what their genetics are and that they're at high risk for this familial, they have the familial hypercholesterolemia, which is much more rare, then you're going to use that drug in the right subset of patient population, and you're going to save over, cost savings of well over 99%.
Personalized, accurate, and early are absolutely critical. It's a chance for you to brag a little bit. We mentioned earlier that Omeda Rx has been recognized nationally for evidence-based medicine. Give us a couple of examples of where we have used our evidence-based medicine practices to the benefit of our clients, and then actually to the country, the healthcare system as a whole.
Yeah. And I think what this also demonstrates is this is not just something that we just started today. We've been doing this for a number of years. We've got a long history of using evidence-based medicine to help us drive decisions. So we've got a lot of experience with it, and I think it really helps us demonstrate the value that we've brought to both our employer groups, our patients, and to, as you said, the healthcare delivery system as a whole. So, for example, here's several of them. These are all happen to be in the oncology area, the first three anyway. Arissa is a medication that came out for the treatment of breast cancer. It was first approved early in 2000s, around 2003. Our review of that medication showed that it really had no proven benefits and that mattered in patients. And we were really concerned about some of the safety issues that came up around it. Ultimately, the FDA removed it from the marketplace, and after several more studies and being able to really determine what population it was best in, they did come back out with this medication, but they put some severe limitations on it. We had already done all that. We had looked at the literature. We were very clear about what the outcomes are that we were looking at. And so our accurate review of that medication really drove the right decision for that medication. Avastin, another great example, this one also for breast cancer. We never considered Avastin to be medically necessary, despite the fact that this drug went through an accelerated FDA approval, like you talked about before, these drugs that go very quickly through the FDA, that gave it approval for breast cancer. It eventually was withdrawn from the market for that indication because finally some long-term studies came out which actually showed that there was no clinical benefit for the use of this medication, so they took that indication away. Again, our early evaluation prevented patients from getting a drug that may have been harmful to them and may have raised false hopes that it could have actually been effective. And then another example is Inclusig. It's a drug that's used for a certain type of leukemia. We had some real concerns about the safety picture for this medication when it first came out. We didn't add it to our formulary. We put very strict criteria, utilization management criteria on it. We wanted patients to use the tried and true medications for this leukemia first. And so again, we wanted, from a personal standpoint, we wanted to make sure that the right patient got the right drug the very first time, and not a drug that we were concerned about some of its clinical efficacy and safety.
That's great. There must be many, many examples of how Omeda Rx is leading the industry in terms of evidence-based medicine and really adapting its way of evaluating medicines to the increase in the volume of medicines in the marketplace, and then the ones that are being approved by the FDA. Must be many.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing those. Before we go and open up the forum for questions, many of our one last topic. Many of our participants on the call today are employers or consultants or brokers who, in one way or another, evaluate PBMs. And the traditional way of evaluating PBMs is primarily focused on cost, ingredient cost, the discounts that a PBM is able to achieve and express in AWP minus, and then also the rebate yield, the amount of discount that's able to be applied because of rebate. that's offered by the pharmaceutical manufacturer. And that's certainly, we can't get away from that, and that's an important aspect. But what I hear you saying is there's another dimension to evaluating PBM, especially now as we're seeing a dramatic change in the pricing structure of the industry and with the complexities that are related to evidence-based medicine. If you could guide some of our participants here in terms of, as you look at PBMs, what questions would you ask them to identify or kind of ferret out what's a good evidence-based medicine program and what's not a good evidence-based medicine program?
Right. So I think there are some really key questions that you need to ask. Probably first and foremost is, what's the basis for your formulary decision? Are you making decisions based on clinical efficacy and safety, or are you making decisions for your formulary based on rebates, on cost considerations? Or how does that all mesh together for that PBM? So it's really important because if you don't make decisions based on clinical efficacy and safety and make it instead on cost considerations, you're ultimately going to impact your long-term costs. You're actually going to potentially increase your long-term costs because you're not using the right drug. Patients are not going to be adherent. They're not going to get the clinical outcome that they need and want, and so you're actually going to increase your long-term costs.
Bad drug, good rebate, increase in costs.
Potentially, yes.
Not good.
Not good. Not good.
Okay.
The second thing that you want to ask about is, what is the process that they use in their evidence-based medicine? Is it a systematic process? Is it consistent between, drug to drug? And is it transparent? So if I came to you and said, why did you make a decision, or share with me your decision process around drug XYZ, they should be able to share with you what their decision was based off of, what studies it was based from, how they made that decision, how they came up with their recommendations. It needs to be transparent. Everyone should be able to see it and understand how they make their decisions.
And it sounds like that criteria needs to be replicated each time. It needs to be very consistent, not only across all classes of drugs and through time.
Absolutely.
I guess I would imagine that if that process changes frequently, that could lead to poor quality, poor outcomes, probably a bad formulary, which could lead to pretty significant increases in costs.
Absolutely. So we're always looking for ways to continue to improve our processes, to make sure that we are consistent and make sure that we have a systematic process that is, like I said, consistent and then also really transparent. And then the third question is do you have an external third-party group that is validating your evidence-based medicine processes? Again, key to show that you are transparent, that you are consistent, that you are systematic. This third party can come in and validate those, that you're doing it well, that you are providing all of those things that you say that you are in evidence-based medicine. So for example, for us, there are a couple different organizations that do this. The primary one that that's well known for this is ICER, which is the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. This is a company, or it's an organization that is well known across the United States, across the world, really, for their support of evidence-based medicine. They have recently come in to Omeda Rx and done an evaluation of our EBM processes and have given us a commendation, really recognized the consistency and the value of the program that we offer and that we provide to our providers and to our employer groups regarding evidence-based medicine. As far as I know, we are the only PBM that has ever received that recognition from this important organization. Another group that comes in that can do some validation around sort of your pharmacy therapeutics process, making sure that you're driving things, is NCQA. And so that's another third party that we're in the process also of getting validation from as well.
It's got to be critical with the dramatic change that's occurring in the pharmacy space and the market forces that are coming at play. Having an external party come in and validate the clinical effectiveness for evidence-based medicine on a consistent basis must be absolutely critical.
Absolutely.
So with that, why don't we open up the forum for questions that the group may have.
Remember, you can submit questions by typing them in the chat box, and we'll send them over to the presenters. We see people busily typing, so Rich and Shirley, feel free to take a drink of water. If we run out of time or have questions that need additional research, we'll follow up on those after the webinar. Okay, Rich and Shirley, I'll pass it back to you now.
Thanks, Dana. I do see a couple questions that have come in. One of the questions is, as an employer, what types of programs should I focus on to help reduce the average number of absenteeism days? Well, I think from my perspective, and I'll let Rich, you can jump in as well, but from my perspective, I think you want to focus on programs that are going to improve your patients' adherence to their medications. Any type of chronic disease management programs that will help patients understand what their disease is, give them a community in which they can sort of interact with and understand the importance of taking care of that disease. So that sort of chronic disease management, care management component would be extremely important and can help drive adherence to medications and therefore improve your outcomes.
Yeah, I would agree. That's a great question. I'd agree with that. Certainly focusing on adherence and compliance for diabetes, asthma, COPD, and one of the effective ways that we're seeing to increase adherence and compliance is moving prescription out of the retail environment into the home delivery environment. We're seeing that as that transition occurs, there's a significant increase in the adherence and compliance of patients filling their prescriptions, taking their medicines, and then refilling their prescriptions as well. It's a great question.
So there's another question here. It says, you mentioned 3 questions employers should ask PBMs. When I'm helping my clients, the employers, find a new PBM or evaluate their existing PBM, at what point in the process do you recommend that we ask those questions? Should they be included as early as the RFP process? I would say yes. You know, I think that those are such key pieces of information for you to understand how the PBM works and how they evaluate medications, that it should be part of the RFP process. It should be included in those questions that you're going to obtain answers from the PBM in order to really understand how they look at medications and whether you feel comfortable with the processes that they use.
I would agree with you, Dr. Wright. The world has changed. It's no longer just about ingredient cost and rebate yield. It's about those two things. They're very important, but it's also about the quality of care and the ability for evidence-based medicine to really have an impact on total cost of care.
So I don't see any other questions right now.
All right. Well, that's great. It's a great conversation. I appreciate Dr. Wright's thoughtful approach, talking about evidence-based medicine, the idea of focusing on value, the idea of focusing on clinical effectiveness and then safety, and then the importance of being early, having an early radar warning system when something's coming is going to have a significant financial impact or may have the ability to improve adherence and compliance. Certainly the importance of accuracy in terms of not standardizing, but making more consistent the prescribing behaviors of folks across the industry. And then finally, the idea of being personalized, being very, very accurate so that we get the right medicine to the right person at the right time. And so we're not being wasteful and we're managing our costs effectively. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Good to be here.
Thank you for all the participants. I'm going to hand it back to Dana. She'll do a quick advertisement for our next webinar, which I believe is happening on August 25th, when Dr. Wright and I will be returning again and having a good conversation with you all.
Thank you, Rich. So thank you, everyone, and please join our next webinar on August 25th from noon to 1. You can always find the latest information for the RxTalks webinar series in the events section on omedarx.com. We will send a follow-up message to everyone on the call that will include a link to today's presentation and recording. Feel free to complete the survey when you disconnect from the call to let us know what you think about this session. Thank you for attending and have a great day.